Okay, great. Okay, good morning, everyone. We have here Monica Spiller from the Whole Grain Connection, and I would like you to meet her. So she's going to be giving us a presentation after she tells you a little bit more about herself and about the Whole Grain Connection. So go ahead, Monica, please.
Thank you, Claudia. The Whole Grain Connection is a nonprofit organization that I started in 2000 after 20 years probably of working towards whole grain foods for everyone. I began first with looking at the bread making and the fermentation process, and then in the 1990s I looked at wheat, grew a lot of wheat, did a lot of experimenting, and finally in 2000, I had selected 12 or so varieties of wheat that were old-fashioned and were good for organic farmers. And I saw that wheat as suited to the organic vegetable farmer when they wanted to have a rotation crop that would be more valuable than something they simply plowed under. So the Whole Grain Connection sells seeds for 12 varieties of wheat, heritage varieties of wheat, suited to California, and we sell them in 25-pound bags, enough for a quarter acre. In other words, we sell them in amounts that farmers can use when they're using their full-scale equipment. That's small scale, but it's possible to actually farm those amounts. They're not just seed packet amounts. Anyway, the Whole Grain Connection's other mission, or its mission as a nonprofit, is to promote whole grain foods and whole grain and the wheat and grains that are needed to produce those whole grain foods, and just generally to promote whole grains as the healthy food that they are. So that's basically it. It's given me an opportunity to meet with farmers, to meet with bakers, to meet with Claudia, and generally to endeavor to understand whole wheat in its entirety. So that's been my occupation for all this time. And so now I would like to try to put some focus into this for this presentation, because I think the potential for whole wheat flour milling in California is very great. And you'll notice I have on the screen a wheat penny. And the wheat penny is emblematic of the importance of wheat in every sense, as a crop and as a food in America. And I also like this penny because it has this motto at the top, the American motto, E pluribus unum. And the broad translation of that would be, we are all in this together. And we all have our contributions to make. So I really like that. And it's certainly very relevant to what we need to do with wheat, starting at least in California. So this first part is going to be about the history of California wheat and milling the nature of the wheat grain and the mill types that we can use. And I think we need this introduction before embarking on working out how to have whole wheat flour milling in California as the norm. So let's continue. It's a lot of writing here, but I need some reminders. So it's interesting to realize that between 1860 and 1880, that's after the gold rush, of course, soft white wheat growing in California was actually a bonanza. There were 3 million acres by 1886, and most of in that time frame, and until now for that matter, the California wheat was mostly exported, and that soft white wheat was the preferred wheat of the time. Things began to change in the 1870s, however, because hard red wheat from Russia was found to be a possible crop in the plains states of America. That includes Canada. And by 1880, there was so much of it being grown, they said, well, we need to develop a milling system that does not produce this dark colored flour that people are not used to. That people were actually used to having a light colored flour, even if it was almost whole grain, and sifting hard red wheat flour didn't even take out enough of the bran, so it was dark colored. But the roller milling system allowed the hard red wheat to be milled so that there was no bran and no germ present, so there was nothing but the white endosperm. And by 1900, California soft wheat farmers found that actually the roller milling system did not favor the white wheat, and so they switched to growing fruit and nuts and found that much more profitable. So California wheat acreage went down to 500,000 acres, more or less, until the present. 1900, the wheat breeders began crossing local soft white wheat with hard red wheat so that they could produce a hard red wheat that the refined flour millers would like. So at least those farmers who were still growing wheat in California began to grow hard red wheat so that they could sell it to the roller millers. The next change really became in the 1950s, 1960s, thereabouts, when conventional agriculture was introduced. And then the breeders worked to produce hard red wheat that was also short, so that the wheat was aimed for high yield and refined flour milling. However, most of the effort of the breeders was towards high yield, and the baking quality of the flour at that time was questionable. And California was one of the places that in the US that set up a lab and an organization to address the situation. And that was in 1983 when the California Wheat Commission and lab were founded. And from that time on, we've had quality control of the new wheat varieties coming from the breeders. the other functions of the California Wheat Commission in that time have been to organize export marketing and also to support the wheat breeding effort towards conventional agriculture and refined flour products. And I can say that that's changing, but that was how it was for most of its existence. By 2000, we have organic agriculture increasingly important, and selected heritage wheat varieties, non-proprietary wheat varieties, were introduced to the organic farmers for rotation on organic vegetable farms. And just last year, in 2019, maybe a little before that, but certainly recently, UC Davis began a program to breed wheat for organic agriculture and whole grain end use. And now here in 2020, we find that California grown wheat is not being purchased in the way that it used to be by the California mills. And that's a cause for concern. So what about the actual wheat flour milling? What happened to that in the state? Well, before 1880, stone milling was everywhere. White wheat gave a light-colored loaves, and it was the norm. It was popular. And once red wheat flour was introduced, dark loaves were the result of using a stone milling system. So in 1880, the roller milling system was invented. We've mentioned that already, but the process really was invented to completely remove the bran and germ from the flour. And by 1900, that conversion to roller milling was practically complete, and stone mills were just left to go derelict. And the result of having that very highly refined white flour available to practically everybody resulted in B vitamin deficiency diseases that at first were not recognized because nobody knew about them, and gradually it became evident that there was a lot of illness due to B vitamin deficiency brought on by using totally refined flour. The bran and germ are the actual source of B vitamins in the flour. So without the bran and germ, people were suffering from these deficiency diseases, beriberi and pellagra. So by 1940, there was a government mandate to enrich refined flour with replacement B vitamins and some minerals. And I might add that enrichment was no longer mandatory by the 1990s in the USA, but it's still mandatory in other places, other countries. So the effect of all this was a steep decrease in wheat and flour consumption, dating, say, until 1975. And obviously people compensated in their diets. And the way they did that was to increase sugar consumption and beef consumption, bearing in mind that the beef was being fed the wheat bran and germ that was taken out of the flour by the roller mill people. So this change in diet led to investigation in the 1970s as to why people's health was degenerating in terms of increased cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And the Mediterranean diet at that time was recognized as one that prevented that onset of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And that diet included whole grains. And in the next few years, dietary fiber was recognized fully as part of the contribution to the prevention of disease. And there was quite an upswing in whole wheat bread production and home milling and mills in health food stores and all kinds of popular whole wheat efforts in that time. And the wheat consumption rose by 2000. It rose again to about 145 pounds a year. But also in that time frame, there were some people who just did not want whole grains, and they were some artisan bakers who wanted the purest flour possible, and to them the purest flour possible had no additives. And so they asked for, and the millers produced, refined flour without any enrichment. And I believe the consequence of that was the wheat rejection movement. I think people eating those refined, unenriched products realized that the wheat was not that good for them. And so that wheat rejection that we're experiencing still is likely due to the nutrient deficiencies in unenriched flour being used at the base of the diet. So here we are in 2020, and we have the COVID-19 pandemic. And the people with underlying cardiovascular disease and obesity and diabetes are among those most severely affected. And you can draw your own conclusions. The other thing that's happened during this pandemic is that the people who have set up small local mills from that time in the 1970s and continually increasing since then, those people found themselves very popular as a source of flour when all the grocery store shelves emptied of commodity flour. And these little local mills ended up being the suppliers and heroes of the moment. So that's meant as background. Not all the story, but I hope it sets you thinking. So let's get down to the business of what milling is all about when it comes to wheat. And of course, we need to think about the nature of the material we're milling. And we're starting with a clean, dry grain, preferably with a moisture less than 10%. And the the wheat grain, what's the material? Well, it has three main parts. It has the skin, or the bran, on the outside, and that's very thin and papery. And it contains fiber and protein and the B vitamins we've mentioned, minerals and other valuable nutrients. And in the mill, in almost any mill, any device that you use to try and pulverize this grain, the bran will always tend to flake. So we need to bear that in mind. And what about the germ? The germ is on the end of the, here it is, the germ on the end of the grain, and that contains the embryo, root and shoot of the new plant, and it contains a lot of oil, valuable oil, protein and B vitamins and vitamin E, very nutrient dense. And as you can imagine, when that's pounded in any way in a mill, it also tends to flake, and the oil will be somewhat squeezed out and spread. So the bran and the germ tend to flake, but the endosperm, which is the main body of the grain, it's where the food storage for the new plant is. And that food storage consists of starch and gluten protein. That's different protein to the protein that's in the bran or the germ. So when that's pulverized or pounded or milled, whatever you want to say, it easily turns into a white powder. So you have three different materials that you're considering whenever you mill. And another thought is, well, the baker might say, well, I want a fine flour. Or the cereal maker will say, I want a cracked wheat. So the miller needs to know what is meant by that. And the ideal way of understanding what is meant by that is to consider the size of the particles. And if you have cracked wheat, then the range of particle size is something like 250 microns up to, say, 5 millimeters. Well, you can imagine a millimeter and the micron, the 250 microns is a quarter of a millimeter. So you get some idea of size in your imagination, I hope. Now, supposing you want some really fine flour, you want to please that baker with some really fine flour. What is meant by that in a whole grain flour? And I'd suggest that the bran and germ will always be larger in the flour. There'll be larger particles than the endosperm particles. But you still want the bran and germ to be fairly fine, but you don't have to get it as fine as the endosperm. So a good range to aim for is that the bran and germ, which is about 15% of the total, should be in the range of less than 850 microns, and it probably will be larger than about 250. And all the endosperm will be less than 250 microns, and a good deal of it less than 180 microns. So what else should we be having in our mind when we're milling? We should also realize that not all wheat is the same. There are broad classes of wheat, and the hardest of all is Durum wheat, and that's rock hard. And you can imagine the mill needs to work harder to mill a really hard wheat to a flour than it would if the wheat was soft. So durum is the hardest. The so-called hard red or hard white wheat, those are sort of 3/4 hard if we have a scale, with durum as the hardest. And they're, of course, harder than the soft red or soft white. And spelt seems to be one of the softest of all wheats. So spelt would be the one that would grind up in a mill the most easily with the least energy. And we'll gradually learn more, but the most effective mills that will grind the bran and germ finely enough while also grinding the endosperm very finely would be the well-maintained stone mill and the more modern air-swept impact mills. And we'll be talking more about those. So let's consider what we have currently and in terms of whole wheat flour. And we have whole wheat flour that's produced in the commodity system with a roller mill. And since roller milling was introduced, whole wheat flour has been a minor product. And that's not surprising because the roller mill is designed particularly to produce pure endosperm flour, pure refined flour without any bran or germ. So the only way it's possible to obtain whole wheat flour in this system is to recombine these parts. So let's see what happens inside a roller mill when wheat is made into flour. And the start of the process is to make the grain wet, or moisten the grain very thoroughly and allow that grain to equilibrate a little bit so that the bran is softened. And then when that moist bran on the outside of the grain reaches the first step in the actual roller mill, there's a roller that will peel off the bran quite cleanly, a little bit like blanching almonds. If you can imagine what happens when you blanch almonds, or maybe when you peel a tomato. Anyway, the wet bran peels off pretty cleanly and it can be collected. And then the grain is passed on to the next stage, and the germ at the end of the grain is cut off again pretty cleanly and collected. And that leaves the endosperm free of bran and germ to be ground into a very fine flour and collected. So if we want the whole grain flour, then we can't just recombine those because it's all wet. And wet grain turns, or wet flour turns moldy in storage. So that wet bran needs to be dried, and it usually is reground because it comes off in such big flakes, needs to be ground into much smaller particles to be put into flour. And the germ, the enzymes have begun to work, and you have oils that are, excuse me, oils that are easily oxidized. So the germ is heat treated to stop that oxidation as far as possible, and that too is dried. And then the bran, the germ, and the endosperm are recombined to make whole wheat flour. Well, I don't think you need me to tell you that there are plenty of disadvantages to producing whole wheat flour in this way. It's inefficient. There are too many steps. The recombination doesn't always produce 100% whole grain because the miller now has the option to leave out the germ or add excess bran, or vice versa, to just add germ and not add the bran, and so on. There are plenty of possibilities there. And the consumer is left wondering whether it is 100% whole grain. The whole process and the fact that it's made in large batches, and usually the intention is that it's going to be on the store shelf for some time, leads to the end result that this kind of flour is often has flavor problems. And in general, this kind of flour has not been popular. Some people reject whole grain flour, maybe because this kind of flour is less than fresh and less than flavorful. So let's see what we can do within the various kinds of mills. The stone mill, we've already mentioned the favorable particle size range, and stone mills, if they're properly adjusted, they can produce that favorable range, either of cracked wheat or very fine flour. And they also have the advantage that adjustments can be made to and the spacing of the stones, the speed of rotation of the stones, and the rate at which the grain is fed into the mill. All of those things can be used to make adjustments. Usually the size of stone mills can be from, say, 3 inches in a household stone mill up to 4 feet in a commercial large-scale mill. And you can have more than one stone mill, of course, in a big milling operation. The stones are usually granite these days, and they can be redressed very nicely. I'll show you the tools in the next slide. You can also have composite stones, in other words, man-made mixtures of stone material that are pretty effective. And the problem usually is that they cannot be redressed. You can't regrind the surface because very often they've put a separate surface on there, and you can't grind that down without losing that surface. But still, some of these composite stones can last a lifetime. And what else can we say? With regard to stone mills, the full range of possibilities, size-wise, and stone composition-wise, is available. So that's and people know how to work them. And generally, the stone mill has history that's hard to beat. So these companies now are making stone mills. You can look them up online. There's Meadows Mills in North Carolina, Jansen Grist Mills, a smaller operation in California. The New American Mills, a new It's, as its name suggests, a new enterprise producing stone mills in the modern style, and some older mills are produced in Austria. They have the Ostierola mills have a nice wood casing. You can see the shadow of this casing on the background of the screen here. And Engsco produce mainly composite stone mills, but they can be very effective too. So it's worth looking into all of those. Here's an example of the tool. This is Roger Jansen of Jansen Grist Mills, and he's working the air hammer tool that will carve a surface. In this case, he's starting with a brand new stone, and he's going to carve into the surface with this tool. And the process is fast. And once you learn the technique of handling these tools, it's very effective. And this tube in the foreground is a vent pulling the dust away from the miller, from the worker. And the company that sells the tools, Trow and Holden, they're selling these tools for sculptors, but they're definitely produced for granite. This is the set of tools. It's interesting to go to their catalogue. See the actual air tool, and then these individual components, according to what it is you're doing, can be fitted. It's a little bit like a miniature pneumatic drill that you see out on the highway sometimes, but this is on a miniature scale. So what other kinds of mills are there? There's one called a hammer mill, and its name pretty much describes it. Within the milling chamber, there's a rotor with freely swinging hammers that fling around inside the milling chamber, and anything inside it is going to be well and truly hammered. And the way in which the particle sizes are determined is to have an exit screen of the particle size screen, such that when the particles, or rather such that no particles can leave that milling chamber until they're as small as the screen will allow. And sometimes air is incorporated to keep the temperature down in a hammer mill, but for the most part, I think they're just used as is, and there's quite a bit of heat development during the milling process. The range of particle size exiting the hammer mill is going to be the same as the screen. Even the endosperm, which normally could get down really fine, as soon as it's 200 microns, if you have a 200 micron screen, then it'll leave the mill and come out just as 200 microns. And as you have seen me mention before, it's possible to mill the endosperm finer even than 200 microns. And the bran, in turn, and the germ is forced to also be 200 microns. So really, you're producing a flour with a very narrow range. It's very effective as a fine flour for bakers. So why not use hammer mills? Well, there are two disadvantages really. One is that if you produce a fine flour, you need a fine screen, and fine screens are delicate and they break down and they need to be replaced fairly frequently, and that's an expense. So hammer mills have their place. There are a lot of hammer mill flour is produced that's whole grain, and that's very useful. But I think we have some better options now. But still, if you want to consider this, there's these two companies I can mention. You'll probably find others, Hosokawa and Shoot. And if you go to these websites, you'll find videos of the mills and a lot more description than I can give. So instead of me trying to give you technical description, I'd say go directly to these websites. And similar story for the Gap mills. It's a similar kind of mill, but the organization of the mill and the airflow into the mill is such that the particle size range that exits is within a narrow range. So again, like the hammer mill, we have a mill that produces particles in a relatively narrow range. And the Gap mills, for instance, have been used particularly for grinding down the bran from a roller mill after it's been dried, of course. And so the Gap mill is used in roller milling facilities when they're making their whole grain recombined flour. They use a Gap mill, I think. So I've put in a Hosokawa again. Hosokawa makes all these kinds of mills. Bauermeister is another one that produces a particularly well-used Gap mill. But the hammer mill and the Gap mill, they're designed to be pulverizers. And so we've taken our time really to come across these mills and use them for milling wheat. But the ones that have come to the fore lately are the so-called air-swept impact mills. And these are impact mills, similar again. The other two would be regarded as the hammer mill and the Gap mill, also regarded as impact mills, but these air-swept impact mills run at huge speeds. They have a rotor inside that spins with a very high velocity, and show you in the next slide. I can sidetrack. Oops, sorry, should have gone forwards. There's one of these high-speed impact mills. This happens to be the Unifine mill, but it's a flat design and there's a rotor inside, and the liner has all these fine grooves on it. And the rotor, this is only part of the rotor, is also grooved. So you can imagine this rotor inside spinning at high speed. The grain enters into the outside edge, and the rotor spins at high speed, and it impacts these grooves, and it doesn't have a chance. It just just pulverizes it. So at the same time, I'm going to go back there, the grain it enters the mill in these two tubes, if you can see them. I'm using my arrow there. The grain enters the mill that's spinning at high speed from two sides, together with a blast of air, a really strong airflow. And so the grain is kept cool by that air. It spins around and is ground up, and then it exits. Can't really see it here, but this boxy piece here is the beginning of the exit tube, and there's a similar exit tube on the right-hand side as well. And I can see the motor underneath it. So the intriguing thing is that there's a variation in effect on the three materials in the wheat. You don't have this uniformity that you find in the gap mill or the hammer mill. The endosperm mills really finely, and the bran and the germ fine enough. So what we've seen is that the fine flour from this kind of mill can have a particle size range that's comparable with a flour that's really finely and well milled in a stone mill. So this is a very valuable realization. I didn't know these kind of mills existed, really. I thought we were limited to the hammer and the gap mill. I didn't know that these really existed until about a year ago, although they have certainly been in existence for 20, 30, 40 years, 50 years probably. 60 years, I think the Unifine mill has been available, but not appreciated until now. So again, three companies that you can look up on the web: the Unifine, the Hosokawa, and the Reynolds. Those you can check out their websites and learn more. We've looked at this picture, we've looked at this picture, and in conclusion, out of all this, we realize that whole wheat milling needs to be single step. We don't want this multiple step milling. It's very inefficient. So single step whole wheat milling is more efficient. It uses very dry grain, so you'll have very dry flour that stores well. A wide range of wheat and grain types can be milled, and that's not so with the roller mill that specializes just in hard red wheat. It's appropriate for on-demand milling of fresh flour. The ideal for whole wheat flour is that it's fresh, and so single-step localized milling is the way to go for on-demand fresh flour. And there are now plenty of grain mills to achieve this. They're all available. They just need to be ferreted out, and the manufacturers are there waiting. So ideally, the bran and germ need to be fine, but it don't have to be as fine as the endosperm. The most effective mills for fine whole wheat flour are the stone mills, provided they're well maintained and operated. And these air-swept impact mills are also wonderful. And why do we need whole wheat flour? Well, we need to have it available for everyone, especially now. to combat epidemic cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And if we had enough whole wheat flour, I think we could reduce the number of severe cases of COVID-19. And in addition, the California State Healthcare Bill could be reduced by $50 billion if we could eliminate those diseases, cardiovascular disease and diabetes. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to telling you the next part of the story of the potential for wheat flour milling, whole wheat flour milling in California. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica, very much.